Now we'll go live with Congressman Cole and hear a few words about the latest in Washington and in the 4th District. Congressman?
Sarah, thank you very much. And to those of you on the line, thank you for taking the time to listen this evening. And we're very interested in your questions, your input, your observations, and your thoughts. As I think about Washington right now, I would call it both the best of times and the worst of times. The best of times in the sense that we really are grappling with some important issues. The President announced today a potential breakthrough on infrastructure, a deal with some Democratic and Republican senators in the United States Senate. We don't know the details of that yet, how big the package is, exactly what the pay-fors would be, so to speak. But I think both sides want to get something very substantial done on infrastructure, and I think there's a good chance that we will. In addition to that, we're beginning what's called the appropriations process. That is the legislation that actually funds the government on a day-to-day basis. And we will start hearings on that next week. The majority, the Democrats, will present their proposals. I will tell you, looking at what we've seen so far, we would expect their defense number to be a little bit low, and that'll be a point of contention. The President in his initial budget proposed a 1.7% increase in defense. That's actually less than inflation, so it would effectively be an inflation-adjusted cut. But the President's also proposing a very substantial increase in domestic discretionary spending. It's everything from health and human services, education, transportation, what have you. And the Democrats are also proposing to get rid of some things that have been very traditional in appropriations bills. Probably the most important of them is the so-called Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment says that no taxpayer dollars can be used for abortion. That's been a red line in the sand for Republicans, but it's actually been a position that Democrats have accepted for 45 years, literally, and it's sort of the compromise position on the life issue. We think that they're likely to try and get rid of the Hyde Amendment, and that will, again, probably generate pretty uniform Republican opposition to any budget deals. But that's the opening position in negotiation. Negotiation will take the balance of the summer and well into the fall. Frankly, probably won't be settled until the end of the year. But at the end of the day, I would expect if there's going to be a deal reached, the defense number will go up. The domestic discretionary spending number will come down, and the Hyde Amendment, which I expect the Democrats to take out of the appropriations bills where it's been in the past, would probably have to go back in. So the two parties start from very different positions, but they're talking, and hopefully they'll bargain with one another. In addition to that, we've in recent weeks had the last of what are called congressional review items, that is, items to undo Trump rules. Some of them are pretty controversial, and particularly where Oklahoma, an energy state's concerned, the debate over methane and what the appropriate levels are for the production of oil and gas are big issues. But again, these are matters of negotiation. We'll see where we end up. So with that, let's open it up, Sarah, and let's talk about what people in the district want to talk about.
Sure, that sounds like a great idea to me. And just again, if you would like to ask a question, just press *3. That's to ask a question, press *3. Our first caller is Preston from Norman.
Preston, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Oh, very, very well, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the influx of illegal aliens coming across our borders, and what can you and other congressmen do? I mean, to me, it's just a total insanity of influx of people, and it's going to have serious ramifications if something isn't done to put a halt to this.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We've actually, the last 3 months, each month apprehended more than 170,000. Actually, the most recent month we have numbers on more than 180,000 people crossing our borders illegally. We think a lot of this, and by the way, this is multiple times higher than a year ago. So a lot of this has to do with undoing a lot of the Trump policies on the border. Probably the most important one is the so-called Remain in Mexico policy. That policy simply meant if you're coming to our borders, you're asking for asylum, which you are entitled to do, you have to prove that you're eligible for asylum under American law. Most people, by the way, that come to the border are not eligible for asylum. About 80% of the asylum cases are disapproved by American courts. You're not a victim of political oppression. You're not in imminent danger. But America is a very desirable place to be, and particularly if you're coming up from some of the countries in Central America where they have drug and violence problems, have a lot of corruption problems. We found with the Remain in Mexico policy, where you had to wait until your case was resolved before you could come in, a lot of people just simply didn't come because they knew their cases didn't merit asylum. Now, particularly if you show up at the border with young children, you're a family unit, you're allowed in, and then you wait for anywhere from a year to 18 months or longer before your case is called up. In that period of time, people have a great talent for sort of losing themselves in the population. Some of them don't come back for court. Most of them, quite frankly, don't. And we don't keep the kind of records we should on where we place people. So Congress can do a lot simply by restoring the policies that sort of gave us some security on the border. We also think, for instance, the suspension of building the wall was a big mistake. The reality is that there are now gaps in the wall. The Trump administration extended the wall that, honestly, multiple administrations had built, beginning with the Bush administration, the Obama administration had, certainly the Trump administration did, and didn't stop everybody from coming, but it if you will, controlled the flow. It moved it towards certain areas. You could concentrate border control there. Right now, our border patrol is, quite frankly, overwhelmed. They're spending a lot of time taking care of people, many of them that need assistance, and they're not able to do the normal activities in terms of not only preventing an illegal flow of people, but preventing drugs from coming into the country, preventing human trafficking. A lot of people that show up on our border, thousands of them, quite frankly, usually young women, are being moved for the purposes of exploitation. So, again, we had a system we think that was working pretty well. We think the Biden administration, this is my personal opinion, undid that system without having something in place and without having the extra resources they would need to actually handle the border. It's interesting to me and discouraging that in the president's proposed budget, he didn't propose any additional resources for the Border Patrol. That's something that sooner or later just simply not going to work. You have to have the adequate number of people to police the border. You have to have the adequate number of resources to help people that are coming across that border that honestly need to be fed, need to be cared for, need to be protected while their cases are adjudicated. So Congress can do a lot, but right now, of course, Democrats control the majority in the House and a very narrow majority in the Senate, actually a very narrow majority in the House as well. So they're not providing the resources that are necessary to defend the border. And I think that's like an open invitation to folks south of us that want to come into the United States. We will have, by the end of this year, well over 1 million. I mean, probably 2-3 million people coming into the country inappropriately, without authorization, not having gone through the normal process. Let me end with this point. The United States is very generous about allowing people to come in. We accept more than 1 million legal immigrants every year. These are people that have played by the rules, people that are sometimes in need, and so it's not like we are a closed society, quite the opposite. But we are the most desirable place in the world as a final location if you're in difficult circumstances, and we do have the right and I think the obligation to protect the American people from folks coming across the border, many of whom are looking for help, but some of whom honestly are here for criminal or nefarious purposes. So Congress can do a lot, but right now the Democratic majority has chosen not to do very much, and I think that's probably sparked this extraordinary influx in the country, which is now higher than any time in the last 20 years.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you would like to ask a question, just press star 3 on your telephone. To ask a question, press star 3. And if you would like to opt into future calls like this, just press 1. Our next caller is Sydney from Comanche.
Sydney, how are you?
I'm fine, sir. How are you today?
Doing great. Thank you for calling in.
Mr. Cole, I'm concerned. I'm 67 years old, and I've just, to quote Ronald Reagan, our government is spending like a drunken sailor. There is absolutely no way that we can afford, in my opinion, we can afford the tax increases it's going to take to pay back the money the Democrats are wanting to do, and I'm concerned that they're intentionally trying to bankrupt us or kill our financial system. What can the conservatives do to stop this?
Quite a bit, and we've stopped some of this. Now, again, we had a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that, frankly, no conservatives, no Republicans voted for in either the Senate or the House. We did work together during the height of the pandemic pretty well. We had 5 coronavirus relief packages. They protected a lot of small businesses, helped a lot of people through a difficult time. I think that was appropriate. This latest one was just way too much. And if you look at the president's budget, the normal budget for the United States is Social Security, Medicare, defense, education, everything. It's about $4.5 trillion a year, a lot of money. The Biden administration proposed about $10 trillion a year worth of new spending. Some of it emergency, some of it would become long-term recurring expenditures. Other than the latest coronavirus relief bill, so far, Republicans have been able to stop that. It still takes 60 votes in the United States Senate to approve a lot of things. In the House, even, the margins are very close. Not every Democrat agrees with this level of spending, the Democrats are struggling to get these bills that expend the amount of money that you're concerned about and I'm concerned about, through the House, let alone through the Senate. So, again, I think you're going to see spending probably the main point of contention between the two parties from now to the end of the year. Now, if in the end they can't come to a deal, we'll end up with what's called a continuing resolution, or so-called CR. And that means we'll hold spending to last year's level other than this emergency spending like we did for coronavirus, and the Democrats have gone beyond. But, again, your point is well taken. When the power changes, and it did change last time, we replaced a Republican president with a Democratic president, replaced a Republican Senate with an evenly divided Senate, but the Democrats still are able to win because on a tie vote, they've got the vice president's vote to break it. The House, again, surprisingly, Republicans picked up seats in 2020. They were supposed to lose 12 to 15. They actually picked up 12 or 15 seats. And so it's very narrow. But, again, we've got to put our fiscal house in order. There are ways to do that, restrain things. And then there's also a big argument about the distribution of money. As I mentioned in my earlier comments, most Republicans think we live in a pretty dangerous world, and we need additional defense spending in the face of accelerated military spending by China and Russia in particular. That's not called for in the president's budget. I don't think you'll see that spending called for in the Democratic majority budgets that we begin to see in the next couple of weeks. We see the defense budget that they're actually proposing. So I expect a major fight over those issues, and I expect if the Republicans are successful, they'll push the defense number up. They'll bring the domestic spending down. They'll also put in things like the Hyde, or restore things like the Hyde Amendment, which protects us from taxpayer-funded abortion. So they'll either do that or they'll hold the line and basically preserve President Trump's budget for the last year of his administration. But again, all that's to be determined in the next few months between now and the end of the year.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you would like to ask a question, just press star 3. And if you would like to opt into future telephone town halls, press 1. Our next question comes from Melinda from Norman.
Hi, Melinda. How are you?
I'm doing fabulous, Congressman. Thank you for holding these. I wanted to tell you that it really makes me appreciate it to have somebody that takes the time to listen. And I know you're extremely busy, but thank you for holding these sessions.
Thank you for taking the time to call in. I know you're using your time right now, too, so thanks very much.
You're welcome. My question is, I was reading an article this morning, and it was saying that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, was saying that the debt ceiling was going to need to be raised, and I wanted to know what your opinions were, because she was stating that if the debt ceiling was not raised, that we would go into an extreme economic downturn.
Well, it certainly, I mean, the debt ceiling reflects, in many cases, bills you've already piled up, so to speak. So there's a point that she has there. But at the end of the day, you have to remember, Democrats increased the debt pretty dramatically in the last COVID bill, almost $2 trillion, with no Republican votes. So there's not likely to be many, if any, Republican votes to increase the debt ceiling unless there are also measures passed to lower the level of spending and to get us on a more sustainable track going forward. So that's going to be one of the big issues, I think, at the end of this session in July, or not session, but this period of time when Congress is in session before August. And I would not be surprised to see this particular debate and fight, quite frankly, bleed into the month of August. But again, just increasing the debt ceiling without changing your plan is like increasing your credit card limit without changing your spending. And unless you can change your income, and the only way to change your income would be either faster economic growth and or increased taxes. Again, I think there's not going to be enough votes to do those sorts of things. Indeed, the president's run into that problem. He's proposed a lot more spending than he has the votes to sustain. It's still a 50-50 Senate. There's only a half dozen seats or votes between the two parties in the House. So at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some hard bargaining where the administration makes some decisions, and again, lowering domestic spending and probably looking at other reforms that save money, or they're going to be stuck with last year's budget, which is something I doubt that they want very much. But your emphasis on overspending, I think, is exactly right, because sooner or later, as an earlier caller said, you got to pay it back. And, that creates an unsustainable level of debt for future generations.
All right. We'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you would like to ask a question, just press star 3. Our next question is about H.R. 1. It comes from Tom from Ada.
Tom, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Well, I'm just fine, sir. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Good. Not only myself, but myself and many of my friends are concerned, very concerned, about the way the Democrats are completely wanting to overhaul our voting system, where there's not going to be much of any accountability. And as far as the mail-in votes, I mean, it's all right to have a mail-in vote, but there needs to be some criteria with it. Not just anybody can have an absentee ballot, and we all know that, but there has to be accountability in our voting system for it to be accurate and for it to be honest.
I couldn't agree more with that. We have a very good system in Oklahoma. I tend to vote by mail because I never know where I'm going to be on Election Day. So, but to vote by mail, I've got to go to a notary public, identify who I am, submit the absentee ballot. It actually works quite well in Oklahoma. We've not had any serious problems of fraud or abuse. That's not true in some other places. So H.R. 1 very narrowly passed the House. It was a straight party line vote. No Republicans voted for it, quite frankly. And when they bought out the Senate version, what's called Senate 1, they could not get the votes that they needed. They have to, again, get to 60 because of the filibuster, and none of the Republican senators voted for this. So I don't think the fight's over, but I think it's unlikely they're going to be able to push through this major overhaul. If you read the Constitution is pretty clear. Each state should decide what its voting laws are. The only time the federal government should be involved is if there's an egregious violation of civil rights. And we've had that at different points in our history. And so, we want to protect the right of everybody to vote, but we want to trust state and local officials to decide how to run their own elections and how to count their own ballots. For instance, in Oklahoma, if you vote by mail, that ballot has to reach the election board by 7 o'clock of the day of the election. Other states allow, for 10, 15, 20 days after, and some states allow what's called ballot harvesting, where literally if you had not voted, somebody could visit your home and say, well, here's a ballot, just fill it out and I'll make sure that it gets voted in. California has a system like that, and it changes the votes after the election. In other words, after the close of voting. And that creates a lot of suspicion. Even if it's done fairly, people worry that, who's really checking this. So I think you're right to be concerned, but I think H.R. 1 has probably effectively been stopped this year, and I think that most of the election laws will remain in the hands of the states, and people in Oklahoma can decide what the rules are and how Oklahomans should count the ballots and who's eligible, again, as long as there was no discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, what have you. Those are civil rights violations. But actually, it didn't get as much publicity as it probably should. I should say for the record, both our senators voted against S1, the Senate equivalent of H.R. 1. So I think, strangely enough, even in a time when Democrats control the presidency, the House and the Senate, Republicans have probably, at least at this point, looked like they've won that fight.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question, and this one comes from Erlene from Moore.
Hi, Erlene. Moore, that's my home.
Yeah, how about that? My question concerns with Medicare and the donut hole and what's being done to reduce that thing so that people like myself can afford to have Medicare.
There actually have been some efforts. Of course, you saw it was actually Medicaid expansion in Oklahoma, but there are a number of provisions to try and do that. You've got to be careful in the sense that Medicare right now is close to going bankrupt. It's within 2, 3, 4 years of doing that. And that's not anybody's fault. It's actually a good thing in some ways because people, particularly the baby boomer generation that's retiring right now, I'm part of that, is living a lot longer than anybody thought they would when Medicare was actually created back in the early 1960s. So we're going to have to look at how you fund the system longer term. Again, more and more people using Medicare is not a bad thing. It just simply means people are living a lot longer than they thought when they designed the program. So, there's pretty serious discussions going on. I don't think the program's in any danger. That it's a popular program. People aren't going to allow it to go bankrupt, but there are big debates over how much additional income you need and how much should individuals be responsible for. I mean, we all know that a Warren Buffett probably doesn't need Medicare, probably isn't on it, but he's certainly eligible to use it. And so, again, it's a really tough policy issue as to how we do this during a period when, thanks to modern medicine, we have a lot more people living a lot longer than used to be the case. Again, not a bad thing, a good thing, but we're going to have to make the adjustments and changes that reflect that.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you would like to ask a question, just press *3. And if you would like to opt into future calls like this, just press 1. Our next question comes from Steve from Mustang.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you.
Yes. I am concerned. I am a licensed carrier, and I've done it by the book and done everything that the government has asked for, but seems like this government now is going against us and trying to get away from our Constitution on the Second Amendment. And I was wondering what's going on there.
Well, you're quite right to be concerned. Look, I have a lifetime A rating from the NRA. I'm a strong defender of the Second Amendment. Frankly, everybody in our delegation from Oklahoma is. Firearms aren't uncommon. Actually, in the 4th District of Oklahoma, almost 1 out of every 2 households has a legally acquired and licensed firearm. And so far, I think most of these gun control measures have not been able to muster the support. There are actually Democrats that represent rural parts of America that agree with us on this. So, again, I think you're going to see the administration continue to push on this front. The president certainly wants to do some things to limit high-powered rifles, the so-called assault rifles. I think that's a misnomer, but so far, I don't think they have the political strength to push that legislation through. So I think we're unlikely to see the changes, but that's not going to stop people from making the effort to severely limit and restrict the possession of firearms. And again, there's no problem. Most of the people that commit crimes, certainly not all, but most with firearms are not legally licensed, are not doing the things that you're talking about doing, that you did. You played by the rules. You're registered. You've done the appropriate training. Those are not the people that threaten. And we do have parts of the country that are a long way away from police. If you're in an emergency for self-protection, you might want a firearm in your home. If it's going to take the police 20 or 30 minutes to get there, and that's not uncommon in rural and small town Oklahoma. And so again, our delegation's pretty strong on this, and that's where we're at. And so far, the administration's not been able to muster the votes to make substantial changes in the Second Amendment.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, to ask a question, just press *3. Our next question comes from Charles from Moore.
Hey, Charles, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Love to hear your question.
Yes, it seems like every decision the president makes costs the American people money and jobs. The first thing he done was cut down the Keystone Pipeline, which cost a lot of jobs and increased the price of fuel. And I'm a disabled veteran, 92 years old, and I was a prisoner of war, and I've been a lot of places and seen a lot of things, but I've never seen the leader of a country do as much damage to the people that live there in favor of illegal immigrants as they do here, as they have here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your service and certainly your sacrifice being a POW. The uncle that I'm named after was also a POW in the Second World War, did the Bataan Death March, and spent several years at Cabanatuan Prison Camp in the Philippines and then Hanawa Prison Camp in the main island. So I have some idea through what he taught me, the sacrifice you made for our country. So everybody on this call appreciates what you did. In terms of energy policy, I think you're right, and I think you're seeing it at the pump. I think the decision to not allow the Keystone Pipeline was a gigantic mistake. It cost 11,000 plus jobs. It also frankly, insulted. That was an energy that was going to be coming from Canada through the United States down to American refineries that could then be used either here or exported. The Canadians actually have been very good friends and allies. We run the Alaska pipeline through the entire length of Canada, and that's been pretty important to our own energy supplies in our country. So I agree with you 100%. The additional decision by the administration to suspend new permitting of oil and gas exploration on federal lands it's not a big deal in Oklahoma because we don't have a lot of federal land, but nationally the federal government has about 20% of the land in the United States is owned by the federal government. And in some states, take like a Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, it'll be 30, 40, up to 60% of those states or more are controlled by the federal government. So a lot of our energy supply is on federal land, and it also applied, by the way, to offshore drilling, and we get more than a quarter of our petroleum supplies from the Gulf of Mexico. So I think these are policies that are short-sighted, and you see it every time you go to the pump. One of the best things the United States has done in the last few years, something that I think, those of us that are old enough to remember the 70s, 80s, and 90s would have never believed America could become energy independent again. We are. We're now the largest energy producer in the world. We were number 3 about a decade ago. And again, that's led to lower energy prices, lower gasoline, lower heating and cooling costs for our citizens, and frankly, a competitive advantage for American industry. So I think the President's policies on fossil fuels have been very short-sighted, particularly given the fact that we've lowered greenhouse emissions more than the next 12 countries in the world combined. We're the world leader in bringing down greenhouse gases. So this sort of hostile approach to energy is a gigantic mistake, and certainly something that, in my view, threatens the future of Oklahoma. We have historically been a major energy producer, and by the way, we're not just an oil and gas state. We get almost 40% of our electricity now from wind power. In other words, Oklahomans have been really very adaptive at let's just do the most efficient way that we can, and we're in all of the above. Whatever the kind of energy is, if it makes sense, let's do it. We want it to be clean, but we want it to be cheap and reasonably priced. That's a big advantage for us. It also helps keep us out of wars in the Middle East. And so I think the President's energy proposal has been a debacle by and large, and my guess is it's going to cost him politically over the long term. Again, people want reasonably priced power to heat and cool their homes and to move about the country, and certainly Oklahoma's been in a position to help the country meet those needs in the last several years. I couldn't be more proud of the Oklahoma energy industry and what it's done. In terms of the illegal migration issue that you alluded to at the end of your comments and question, I think you're spot on. And look, I think there's no reason to reverse policies that are working. We had a lot more border security 4 or 5 months ago and a lot lower influx of people that are entering the country illegally than we have today. I hope when Vice President Harris goes to the border, which she's going to do tomorrow, she listens to what the Border Patrol tell her. I mean, mostly the Trump policies on the border were driven by what do the people we're asking to do the job tell us they need. Well, they wanted Remain in Mexico authority. They wanted the wall to be completed and strengthened. They wanted additional resources. We did those things, and it resulted in a much more manageable border situation that we did today. And that's not just, again, a question of people coming into the country because they're desperate to find a better life. We all understand that. A lot of us have that tradition and that history in our own family. On the other hand, when we weaken the border, we've now quadrupled the seizure of illegal drugs, and we don't come anywhere close to getting all the illegal drugs coming into the country. We've increased the number of people that we've stopped that are engaged in human trafficking. That's the exploitation, again, usually of young people, usually of young females those are bad things. So we need a much heightened security policy on the border. And I think if the Vice President will set aside the ideological blinders and simply listen to what the people we've asked to do the job. I sit on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee on appropriations, and of course we have Tinker and Fort Sill in our district. We are a major military district. I listen very carefully to what men and women in uniform tell me they need to do the job we've asked them to do. We should do the same thing with our Border Patrol. If they're the ones on the front line, they're putting their lives at risk to protect the rest of us. If they say they need certain things, we should listen and try to provide them with what they need, both in terms of authority and in terms of resources. I think this administration has simply not done that, and that's one of the reasons why you see a crisis on the southern border right now.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you would like to ask a question, press *3. That's *3 to ask a question. And if you'd like to opt into future calls like this, just press 1. Our next question comes from Susan from Walters.
Susan, thank you for calling.
Thank you for having me. This is so interesting. I wanted to talk just a little bit, ask a question about, as we went through this pandemic, we have a lot of Native families that were so affected by this, and then they also were not in school and trying to navigate the virtual part of our schooling. And I feel like we've lost a lot of headway with some of the kids that were in the rural community not even be able to get online. Some of our rural communities are having problems with that, and then not having devices, and then having elders that are in the home with them. So there were so many things that were going against some of our children. And so my question is, we've had some things happen on our state level that are going to affect rural communities. Where can we do, and what would be some of the things that might help from the federal government as we go through, continue on this pandemic, and so our kids do not lose any more
time in the
on what's happening?
Well, it's a mixed picture out there. I would say Oklahoma gets high marks for keeping the majority of its kids in school. Most kids in Oklahoma, outside of Oklahoma City and Tulsa, those have been the two big exceptions, but most of our school districts, and I say this, my son is actually a public school teacher in the Moore system, and that system has been open continuously since August, and other than, the bad weather we had in February, those kind of things, they've kept their kids in school, and that's been good. Where kids have not been in school, number one, they're less vulnerable to the pandemic, certainly up to this point, than people that are, 60 and above. And our administrators and teachers have really done a pretty phenomenal job of educating our kids and keeping them in school. But where that has not happened, we get higher rates of suicide, we get higher rates of drug abuse, we get kids dropping out of the system because they're not checking on virtually. You put your finger on a really key problem when you talked about some parts of our state, particularly rural and small town Oklahoma, don't have the broadband that we need. One of the good things I would tell you that's happening, both in the pandemic relief packages Congress passed last year and the discussion we're having on infrastructure now, is there's now a consensus that we need to build broadband throughout the United States. It's sort of the electricity of the 21st century. You remember there were a lot of homes in Oklahoma in the 30s and 40s, particularly in rural Oklahoma, that did not have adequate electricity. Our rural electric co-ops were created to deal with that problem. They've done a fantastic job. We need to do the same thing now going forward. And I think this is actually an area where Democrats and Republicans agree. It's also a matter, by the way, of public health. We changed the regulations for telehealth, that is the ability of doctors and healthcare professionals to deal with you online and over the phone and be able to prescribe. That's been a good thing. That's helped. So I think some of the emergency measures we adopt will probably become, permanent. But closing schools, and again, I'm not throwing rocks at anybody here. I think people were trying to make decisions before they had as much information as we're privileged to have today was a mistake. Do we need to adapt? Yes. Do we need to have more virtual learning options for people? Yes. But the reality is kids are simply better off in school under adult supervision with some structure. I know talking to teachers around my district, they worry about their kids when they don't get to see them. They worry, is the kid getting adequately fed? Is there an abuse situation that needs to be reported? Or are they just having some structure and some adult supervision, guidance, and role models that they can do? And anything that disrupts school is bad. Kids lose time, they lose social activities, and we know all kinds, again, of other problems like suicide, drug abuse, depression tend to build when young people are not in school. So Oklahoma did a better job than most places, and particularly, quite honestly, our rural communities and smaller towns probably did the best, and most of our suburban communities did well. Again, I live in Moore. It's a big school district. Our school was constantly open. I can't say enough good things about the administration and the teachers and the school district that I live in, and what they did to make sure their kids continued to get adequate education and schooling and supervision under difficult circumstances. But I think we know going forward, the Center for Disease Control, which is our premier institution that deals with these, was saying months ago, don't shut the schools. It's better for the kids to be in school. We can take the precautions that we need. They're going to mostly be able to get through this okay. If they don't, they're a lot healthier, honestly, than senior citizens are. They're more likely to throw it off. There was actually more danger in closing schools than there was in keeping them open. And the places that kept their schools open, and we have lots of information on this now, did far, far better than the places that closed their schools down. So, again, I'm proud of our Oklahoma educators and schools, and most of these decisions are made at the local level. It's not, the federal government should not and does not control your local school board. That's a decision that you make locally. You elect the people that are there. They're your friends and neighbors and in your community. They're the people best able to make the decision. I think for the most part, they made good decisions in the state of Oklahoma, and we're suffering a little bit less for our young people having than other places around the country, particularly more urban areas on the east and west coast.
All right. If you would like to ask a question, just press *3 on your telephone. We still have a little more time in this call, so it might not be too late to still get your question in. But our next question comes from John from Ardmore.
John, how are you?
Doing fine. How about yourself?
Very good. Always good to hear from Ardmore. That's where my parents grew up, and I went to Charles Evans Elementary there. So, love Ardmore.
Is that right?
I did.
Well, great. Hey, you get an A today.
Well, actually, the first place I ever put on football pads was at Charles Evans. That's where I learned how to play football, which served me well in Moore later, where I finally, my dad ended up after he retired out of the service.
Oh, golly, that's fantastic. No, I just, one of my questions was already asked, so I didn't, I withdrew my question for you, but I did want to tell you I think it's great of what you're doing and what you're doing for Oklahoma. I feel like Oklahoma is a mighty perfect place, if a place can be perfect. And we don't have a lot of problems that the big cities have. And I think that all of this helps with us having this type of vicinity to live in.
Well,
and
go ahead. And I think our people, maybe it's a little bit of the frontier heritage, but they tend to hang together really well in tough times. We've gotten through depressions and tornadoes and droughts and you name it. And the strength of Oklahoma communities, I think, is really quite exceptional.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But again, if you'd like to ask a question, just press *3. Our next question comes from Billy from Oklahoma City.
Billy, this is Tom Cole. How are you?
Hey, doing pretty good.
Good.
Thank you for letting me speak on your call.
Sure.
My question is about fiscal spending in general. Talking about administration changes and how there is a lot of waste involved in that. Just as an example, the Trump administration with the border wall and then Biden taking over, and now all that spending that the government and taxpayer money that went towards the wall, whether you agreed with it or not, is now being wasted.
It is.
In administration.
Yeah, no, we led a lot of contracts, and of course, President Biden has the authority. He suspended those contracts basically his first day in office through executive orders. So we literally had construction going on that was stopped the day he was inaugurated, and have material that's already been purchased. We ought to finish those things. Again, you may or may not agree, but this, and I would not tell you that a wall in and of itself is the only thing that controls the border, but it makes a big difference. And even the Obama administration built wall because it sometimes you funnel the population that's coming in illegally into an area. You can concentrate your border control there, and it's a mistake. So sometimes politics outweighs what any good administration would tell you. Once you've made an investment, see it through. If you don't think you need to do more, that's one thing, but let's at least finish what we'd already assigned money for, bought materials for, contracted with individual business for. We still have to pay those contracts, whether they're doing the work or not. And so I agree with you. That's a huge waste. But more importantly, we weren't just building a wall to build a wall, and it was having an impact and helping us get a better handle on our southern border.
All right. Our next question comes from James from Comanche.
Hey, James, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. How are you today, Mr. Cole?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Mike, we were talking about education a while ago, and I've noticed or read a lot about a lot of these schools starting to teach this critical race theory stuff. And I know that the governor signed a bill says they can't teach it in Oklahoma, but I also know that they sneak it in under other names. Do we have and is there something we can do on the federal level to make sure that this is crap?
Well, I agree with you. Critical race theory is I think a very discredited ideology and undermines what the country's like. We've been working for a long time, and not always successfully, as you know, to try and do what Martin Luther King said. Let's judge you by the content of your character and who you are, not the color of your skin. That hadn't always been the case. We all know we've had some terrible incidents of racism, things like the 1921 race riot in Tulsa. But the country is, I've reached the age where I lived through the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, and I will tell you, we are a lot better country than we were. We've moved broadly in the right directions. In terms of critical race theory in the classroom, fortunately, the federal government has no power to set the curriculum in schools. It can, set examples, and it can offer, grants, but I actually had the Secretary of Education, Secretary Cardona, in my office yesterday discuss this very topic, and he acknowledged we don't have the power to do that. So the curriculum in your local school is set by both your state government and your local school board, and people that are worried about what's being taught ought to focus your attention there. Again, I think the state of Oklahoma has made a strong statement about what it thinks is appropriate and inappropriate in this area. And so, again, I can't answer for every classroom or every teacher in Oklahoma, but I think by and large, that is not happening in Oklahoma schools, and I don't think our educators or our state and local officials are going to allow it to happen. But we do have to keep an eye on it in Washington, D.C. There are some people that want to, lay this out as an appropriate way to look at American history. look, I'm not naive about history. I'm Native American. I'm Chickasaw. So my great-great-grandfather was forcibly removed from Mississippi, and he was removed because he was a Native American. So that's an instance of racism. On the other hand, his son became treasurer of the Chickasaw Nation. His grandchildren, great-grandchildren are in office. My mother was the first Native American woman ever elected to the state Senate. We honor our Native American history. I serve in a congressional seat where my predecessor was an African American, J.C. Watts. He was elected in an overwhelmingly white district. I think he served that district extraordinarily well, served our country extraordinarily well. So again, we've made a lot of progress in the right direction, and we need to focus on that. Our founding ideals are pretty clear, I think, in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Both those documents were written when we had slavery in the country, but slavery was ultimately incompatible with the principles, and it took us a long time to learn it. Again, I'm not naive about race, and that we certainly have had periods in our history where if you were African American or Native American or Asian American, you weren't treated with respect. But we've made a lot of progress, and we just need to continue to do that and focus on our basic ideals that all people are created equal, that everybody deserves equal justice on the law, that everybody deserves a shot at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We do those things, we'll be okay and get through this. And again, I would argue we've made more progress in dealing with these matters than most people in the world.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. But just a reminder, if you would like to opt into future calls like this, just press 1. Our next question came from Patricia from Fletcher.
Hey, Patricia, how are you?
Good evening, Congressman Cole. I first of all want to thank you for your continuing support of surviving spouses. I am a surviving spouse, and I have spoken to you before on behalf of Gold Star Wives of America. We are still looking to have an increase in DIC. There are about 10,000 DIC recipients in Oklahoma. I would guess most of us are in your district because of Tinker and Fort Sill.
Quite a few.
Yeah, but there is it's not so much just we want more money, it's the fact that there is a disparity in what is paid to military survivors and survivors of other federal employees. The Congressional Research Service found this to be true in 2013 in a report. They reaffirmed it in 2015 in a report. My husband graduated from high school in 1965 from Midwest City. He volunteered, he enlisted, he volunteered for a hardship tour in Korea, then he volunteered for service in Vietnam, and he was there for Tet and the relief of Khe Sanh. He was in the Army. But it concerns me that his death is less honored by our country than the death of someone from the Department of Agriculture. Not to pick on the Department of Agriculture, but
I understand.
The disparity is 12 to 15%, so it's significant. We do have a bill in the Senate. We have dropped a bill in the House that's in the process of being set up. And my question is, what's the likelihood of your continued support of this issue?
Well, it's 100%. My dad was career Air Force. My grandfather was career United States Navy. My uncle, as I mentioned earlier, was in the Navy and, again, did the Bataan Death March. He was turned into an infantryman, at the beginning of the Second World War because they were scuttling. He was on a little gunboat called the Canopus, and it was brought back from China and fought. My older brother, is a Vietnam-era veteran, did not serve in Vietnam, but has a disability associated with his service. I think these are things the American people want us to do. They honor the people that serve, like your late husband, and that did so as a volunteer under difficult circumstances. We've made some progress in these areas, but not enough. So we're going to continue to do it. And I will tell you this, the United States, to its credit, actually does more for its veterans and surviving members and families than any other country in the world. Matter of fact, than every other country in the world combined. But again, that's what the American people want us to do. They respect service. They respect those who served. And I can tell you, having grown up in a military family, the spouse and the children serve every bit as much as the person in uniform because they support them and they run extraordinary risks. I remember once being at Lawton at what's now Freedom Elementary. Then back then it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the school. It was, I think it was Geronimo Elementary, but I may be wrong about that. And I went in, these were all young kids from the 1st to the 5th grade, there to talk to them. And the principal, he said, before you say anything, I want to show you something. And these were all little kids, and the oldest one's probably 11, 12 years old. And he goes, I want the number of you who have a parent serving in Afghanistan or Iraq to raise your hand. About a third of the hands went up. And he said, I want any of you that have had a parent serving, and essentially almost all the hands up. Those kids, that meant a parent, maybe both, were gone for a year or more out of their lives when they're very young. That kind of sacrifice, and that kind of support from a family deserves to be recognized and supported. So I will always be, very strong on that. And you're exactly right. Our district, because of the very military nature of it, Fort Sill, Tinker Air Force Base, we have a lot of Oklahoma National Guard presence in our district as well, has a really disproportionately high number of veterans and family members that supported their parents or their extended family when they were in the service. So we're going to always try to do what we can to make sure those folks are compensated for and protected for the service that their family provided and the support that they provided to their family members that wore the uniform.
Okay, I think we have time for just one final question. But again, if you would like to opt into future calls like this, just press 1. Again, to be a part of a future telephone town hall, just press 1. Our final question comes from Tommy from Moore.
Hey, Tommy, how are you?
Well, I'm okay, Mr. Tom. How are you? And thank you for your service, by the way.
Thank you. You're very kind. I appreciate that.
With everything going on we have, Tom, I'm really concerned for the influx of the criminal element we have at our border, obviously. I'm really troubled by the amount of violence that we're seeing in our streets of our cities and what was permitted last summer. It's deeply disturbing to me that we're not doing anything about that, or doesn't seem to be anyway, and addressing the domestic violence that we have, and I would refer to it as domestic terrorism whenever we see people dragged out of their cars and shot for no reason, like that just happened in New York City. I reflect back to the days of the Clinton administration, whenever he put, if you recall, 100,000 boots on the ground to fight the crime and the criminal element out there. I just feel like that's something we're not addressing like we should. In our country, with the drug cartels, the organized crime, and to stop some of this. And I'd like your feelings on that, please.
I think you're exactly right. I served with several members that were career law enforcement officers. I think of my friend John Rutherford from Florida, who was a sheriff in a big metropolitan area in Florida, or Pete Stauber, who was a career police officer from Minnesota. This whole movement about defunding the police is, I think, a gigantic mistake. It is very tough to be a law enforcement officer these days, and look, we all want to make sure that there are no abuses, and occasionally there are, and certainly we've seen some of them pretty dramatic, so I don't minimize that. But the reality is the vast majority of people, men and women that put on police uniforms and go out and put themselves in danger to protect the rest of us are extraordinary heroes. And, they deserve our support and our respect. They generally need additional resources. We actually have done some things to try and provide some additional resources. One of the biggest debates we're having now is on police reform. I've talked to many of the police chiefs in the 4th District about what are the things we need. And, they're not against reform. We would like to have a national registry. So if there's a police officer that has been guilty of abuse or violation, we know that before we hire them. We'd like to, most of them are against the use of, deadly chokeholds and things like that. Most of them want body cameras for their officers, something that, again, the federal government can and should help with. But they also want to protect what's called, limited liability, limited immunity, where police officers, let's just say somebody pulled a guy over for going 80 miles an hour on a 60-mile-an-hour road, they shouldn't have to risk being sued personally. So we're actually in that fight. Tim Scott, who's an African-American Republican senator from South Carolina, I served with him in the House, one of the very best members I think we have. And the two former officers that I mentioned, are kind of our leaders on this issue. But, God bless the police that protect us all. And, I think they need the support and they need the additional resources. Mostly they need to know people appreciate what they do and support what they do. So Oklahoma is very much, I think, a state where we appreciate people that serve. We appreciate people that put on a uniform and protect us from our enemies abroad. We appreciate people that, patrol our streets and make our people safe. We appreciate the service of our teachers and other public employees and our firefighters that protect us or help us out when tornadoes hit us. You live in Moore, Oklahoma, you know something about tornadoes, I can tell you that. And boy, the number of times we've had firefighters and police officers from our neighboring municipalities or places as far away from Lawton that have helped us, I am grateful to those people. So, again, I think we're fine inside our state in terms of the public attitude, but I do think we have had an extraordinary wave of violence over the last year. If you look at murder rates in a lot of our major cities or violent crime rates are up, to me that calls for additional federal support and resources to help some pretty hard-pressed local departments. And it also calls for us thanking the men and women that are on the front lines, again, risking themselves and whose families know that any day, there could be pretty bad news for their mom or dad that's wearing a uniform helping us out. Those people deserve, they're heroes in my view. So we're very much on that side, and I think that just reflects what the people that live in Oklahoma and certainly our part of Oklahoma believe, and I think every part of Oklahoma. So we're going to continue to work with law enforcement, and we're going to try to get additional resources there, and we're certainly not going to vote for things that limit their ability to protect us or put an undue burden on what's already, I would argue, an overstressed force. Appreciate you speaking up on their behalf, and you're right to be concerned because the crime indicators, after having come down pretty dramatically, and let's not forget that, violent crime is less prevalent in the United States now than it was 30 years ago. But the last 2, 3, 4 years it's ticked up. We need to stop that now and nip it in the bud. People have got to be safe to go about their business, to enjoy their lives with their family, for their kids to go to school and them not be worried about what's happening to them. So, again, we're pretty much a very pro law enforcement delegation in Oklahoma, and I think that's going to continue to be the case.
Okay, well, we are near the end of the telephone town hall. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions tonight, but you will have the opportunity to leave a message and receive a call back from our office after the Congressman provides some final words. Sir?
Thank you very much, Sarah. First of all, let me thank all of you for taking the time to listen to the call and participate. I appreciate the questions, and like Sarah, I'm sorry we couldn't get to more, but thank you for hanging with us. Number two, our office is there to assist you in a whole variety of ways, whether it's veterans benefits or Social Security benefits or questions, or we really value your input, what you think, the things that you think are important that we ought to be doing to try and make life better. We did not, for whatever reason, on this call, talk COVID, and I not want to stick my nose in anybody's business, but I will urge you, if you haven't gotten the vaccination, please do so. Believe me, I have one. Every member of my family has one. We have some new variants. We've made a lot of progress in Oklahoma, but Oklahoma is also ticking up now in new cases, and that's because this new Delta variant that comes out of India, it's not more deadly than what we've seen, but it is more infectious. And if you've got your vaccination, you're okay, because it's got the same level of effectiveness against this as it does against the earlier deals. But if you haven't, you're a little bit more at risk than you probably think you are. So I would urge you to at least consider that. I think, again, our public health people, our state government, our tribes, it's not hard to get a vaccination, so please think about that. Last thing, again, you're going to hear, we're sort of in a time where a lot of people question the country and wonder how well we're doing. And I always tell people, we talked a lot about immigration tonight, and appropriately so. I'll know the United States has a problem when people want to leave instead of people are trying to get in. It's a pretty special place that we're all privileged to live in. And, we just did an extraordinary thing, Operation Warp Speed, developing multiple vaccines in a year, faster than any time in human history, 10 months actually, is an amazing achievement, getting it distributed across a great continental nation. This country is a remarkable country. It has a brilliant future, and it has really, great institutions that have kept us free. We think of ourselves as a young country, and we are, but we're the oldest functioning democracy in the world. Our people are freer and have more opportunity than people anyplace else on the planet. So when you go to sleep tonight, if you're so inclined, thank the people that protect us. Bless the people that keep us secure at home, that educate us, that fight on the front lines, whether it's on a foreign battlefield or whether it's fighting COVID in your local hospital. And remember how lucky you are and blessed you are, all of us are, to be Americans. Again, it's an amazing country, and it's gotten through some extraordinarily difficult challenges, certainly in my lifetime, but much more importantly over the course of its history. It'll continue to do that. I get to interact, because I sit on the Defense Appropriations Committee, with our men and women in uniform probably more than most, unless you actually serve. And I get to see our young people. We've got 5 colleges and universities. I travel a lot to our high schools. Don't worry about it. We've got a great young generation coming up. Americans are good and decent people, so don't lose your faith in the country. Just keep working and let us know what we can do to be helpful and what we ought to be doing to advance the interests of our district and, more importantly, the best interests of our country.